Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Irtika Cheryl, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here for our fifth episode with the brilliant Dr. Farhad Shafti. Dr. Shafti, it's always an honor to have you with us.
Salam alaikum.
Welcome once again.
Salam alaikum. Thanks for calling me brilliant. That's very kind of you.
Well, you are.
Thank you.
Today, we're diving into a topic that is foundational to understanding Islam and something you decided a significant part of your life's work too. The very nature of the Quran. We're going to, I think that if I'm not wrong to say that is the crux of what it is that you insist upon. We're going to explore what the Quran is and perhaps just as importantly, what it is not. So let's start with the broadcast possible question to set the stage. When you're speaking to someone who has little to no familiarity with Islam, how do you initially introduce the Quran to them? What's the elevator pitch for this sacred text?
Okay. So, as you said, Irtala, this is a very important question because, yes, it is true that the Quran, we Muslims believe, is a revelation. But at the end of the day, like any other book, unless we know exactly what is it that is in front of us, we will not be able to use it in the way that it was intended. And we may even misuse it, as many people do. And it is not enough to say that, oh, I know what the Quran is. It's revelation by God. Okay, that's fine. But what is really the nature of the Quran as a book? As a book, what is it that we have in front of us? In order to answer that question, let me first start by saying what I think the Quran is not. And then from there, hopefully, we can get to see what I think the Quran is. And again, I want to emphasize, as we have discussed it before in the previous episodes, and I think in particular episode 1, the idea here is not to convince our dear audience about what I'm talking about. It's just to share some thought with some evidence and reasoning. It is obviously totally up to the audience to decide how much this might be an acceptable and reasonable view, or they may have their own criticism about it, and that's absolutely fine. So I'm not trying to convince people about any of these. I'm trying to just share my understanding. That's all that I'm trying to do. So another thing I want to say is that before starting to think about what the Quran is or what the Quran is not, another thing we need to understand is that we are not talking about what the content of the Quran is, because these are two different questions, okay? So if you ask me what the content of the Quran is, then the answer is very easy. I just look at the Quran and I just list the content for you. I say, well, there are legal verses, there are verses about morality, there are verses talking about other prophets, there are verses about heaven and hell, etc., etc., etc. That's the content of the Quran. That's not the question that you're asking me. You're asking me what is the nature of what is the Quran as a book? Okay, so let me start. I do not think that the Quran is book of law. Again, I need to remind everybody and myself, that doesn't mean that I do not believe or I don't know that in the Quran there are verses that are about law. Of course there are verses that are about law. But I do not consider the Quran to be book of law. Do you know almost what percentage of the verses of the Quran are about legal issues, Ertaqa? Can you guess? Like, for instance, if we have consider all the verses of the Quran, okay, 6,000 something different views about how they separate the verses, 6,600 something. And then we try to highlight the verses that are giving us some law, different law, penal law, marriage law, divorce, inheritance, etc., etc. What percentage of the Quran do you think are verses about law? ارتقا? Just give me a number. I'm not testing you.
If I just have to guess, I would say 25%.
25%. Okay. It's 8%.
Okay.
8% of the verses, 8%, almost, of course, almost. It's, yeah, as I said, it depends because, you know, the number of verses can be counted in a different way. But 8% of the verses of the Quran are about law. 92% are not about law. Okay. I do not think that the primary function of the Quran is to provide law for the audience of the Quran. Please do consider the words that I am using. Primary function. So that doesn't mean that I deny that there are some verses that do have law, and this was a function, yeah. But I don't think the primary function of the Quran is to provide law. Later on, not in this episode, I think in one of the other categories that we are going to discuss, I will discuss about the Sharia and the law of the Islam, or to be more accurate, the law of Sharia. And there I will argue that much of the law of that we have in the Quran, in particular the social law, and there are many scholars that are arguing that this social law was customized and specific for the direct audience of the Quran around 1400 years ago in Arabia, and that for our time, and these are not literally applicable, and they need to be adjusted or even changed or adapted. I will talk about this later in another episode, but with all that I said, I hope I can establish that given all this, I do not think that the Quran is book of law. It does have law, legal statements, but I don't think it's book of law. I do not think that Quran is book of history. Yes, in the Quran we do have verses that can be considered as historical verses. These are verses that are talking about prophets. But I don't think that the objective of the Quran for providing that history to us is to teach us history or to inform us about history. I think that's not the reason that we hear about the story of Moses, story of Joseph, Yusuf. I don't think God intends to inform us about historical facts. I think there's a message behind those verses, behind those stories, that is being delivered to the audience of the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as the first audience, and then the rest of the audience. In fact, and this is again something that we will discuss it later in other categories that we are going to have some episodes on them. In fact, there is a view among some scholars that actually, when the Quran talks about history and historical things, it may not necessarily refer to actual history. Yeah, some of it might be just using the biblical stories that were around to make a point, rather than reporting the history for us. Interestingly enough, as you know, and I'm sure any Muslim that have read the Quran once can appreciate that, the Quran does not really give us what we do consider as scientific history. We don't have it. It's a story of the prophets that we have. So whether all these stories are actual facts is something that some scholars do argue about it, and I repeat again to take away any misunderstanding. it's not about whether the Quran is giving us the correct history or the wrong history. And the scholars who argue about this say that, look, not necessarily all these stories are intended to provide actual facts. Some of these were in the mind of people, were around, and Quran is utilizing them. I do not believe that the Quran is book of science. Okay? Now, I do know that there are people who have even tried to analyze verses of the Quran and extract some meanings, and even argue that the speed of light is in the Quran. You should just analyze it and you can find it. I don't believe that Quran is book of science. I don't believe that when the Quran talks about natural phenomenon around us, like moon and sun and stars, or the nature around us, or how human being is is made and is coming to life. I don't think that the Quran intends to teach us or even inform us about science or natural things. Again, I think the intention is to deliver a message on the basis of understanding that people at the time had about these phenomena, about these concepts, about these things. Some people say that the Quran is complete code of life, or say that Islam is complete code of life, which then should mean that Quran is complete code of life, because Quran is main source of Islam. I don't think that any religion, Islam, Quran, Christianity, Bible, any religion is complete code of life, simply because it is impossible. We are not talking about whether God has provided something like that. We are talking about whether human being can be utilized something like that. It is impossible. There are lots of difficulties that we have in life, and we cannot find answers for them in the Quran or in any other book. So no, I don't think that Islam or Quran is complete code of life, unless, of course, by code of life we mean something very specific, and I will get back to that. Also, the style of the Quran is not a textbook style. It's not a textbook style. You see, you have done studies, higher education, and I'm sure many of our dear audience have also done higher education, and even in the school. We all know what a textbook look like. Yeah, a textbook has a very specific objective. It has a table of contents, go through one topic to another topic in a very structured way, intending to teach you something. By the end of each chapter, you must have learned something. Yeah, there might be some questions to make sure that you have learned them. And by the end of it, you will say, okay, I totally learned this. Quran is not a textbook. The style of the Quran is not a textbook. If the style of the Quran was a textbook style, we did not have so much debate and arguments about the meaning of this chapter and that verse and this topic and that concept and all that. Yeah. In fact, we may even didn't need any of these episodes, because hey, the textbook is already there. Why do we need to even talk about the Quran? It's all there. So these are the things that I think Quran is not about them. So then the question is, in my understanding, in my humble understanding, what the Quran is all about. Well, in the last two episodes, we talked about the criteria for success in the hereafter. And we looked at the verses of the Quran. And I think we established on the basis of verses of the Quran, explicit verses, that criteria for success is tazkiyah, purification, spiritual purification. Okay? So on that basis, I say that the Quran is a book for purification. Okay? My sentence is not yet finished, because still, if a book is for, let's say, purification, still the book can be in different styles. It can be a textbook on purification, yeah? It can be bullet points on purification, yeah? So I will continue that. But before continuing, let me just have a footnote. So in my understanding, Quran is a book for purification. Why is that? Because we discussed it last time, because the criteria for success is purification, spiritual purification. And if you remember, we looked at verses of the Quran, and I argued that based on these verses, even the purpose of religion is spiritual purification. Okay, we looked at verses of the Quran. So friends who haven't seen it, if they are thinking that, oh, but we also have يعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة, so what about that? We have discussed that in the last episode. So I encourage them to please have a look at the last episode. Okay, so when I say the purpose of the Quran and what kind of book Quran is, and I say it's a book for purification, then that means that all those legal verses, they are there for purification. All those references to the Prophet's stories, whether we agree with scholars who say maybe not all of them might be factual, and these are utilization of biblical stories, or those who say no, these are all true history. Anyway, all of them are for the purpose of spiritual purification. That's the reason we are reading them and listening to them. All references to phenomenon, the nature, and the sun, moon, stars, and all that, that is for purification. Okay, but as I said, when we say it's for purification, still somebody might say, okay, but what kind of text this is, because it can be a textbook for purification, or as I said, a bullet point for purification. I use the Quran to answer that question. And the word that the Quran uses in introducing itself is the word dhikr. Dhikr. Dhikr can be translated as reminder and advice. An advice that inbuilt in it is a reminder for you, or a reminder that inbuilt in it is an advice for you. Okay, so advice and reminder. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We have revealed this dhikr to you, and we are protecting it, which in my understanding is protection in the process of revelation. Surah Al-Hijr, verse number 9. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. We have revealed to you, we have sent to you this zikr, so that you can explain to people, you have clarified for people what have been come to them, and so that they can think about it. Nahl, verse number 44. Sad wal Qur'an dhikr. So Sad, which is one of the letters in the Quran, that's another story, and the Quran that has zikr in it. And that is Surah As-Sad, verse number 1. In huwa illa dhikrun lil alamin. This is not but a book that is zikr for alamin, for everybody. I intentionally translate alamin as everybody, because there's a thinking behind it that in some other episodes hopefully we can talk about it. Yes, the Quran has introduced itself with other things as well, like nur, like furqan, light, something that separates. But it's then up to the individual reader of the Quran, who with his own or their own analysis, they can understand what word is the main word and what words are just application of that word. So if you want to draw it, you put one word in the center, and then you put arrows, and then you put other words around it. I think because of the emphasis of the Quran and because of the style of the Quran, dhikr is that one word in the center. Yeah, every other thing, Nur, Furqan, and شفاء ورحمة للمؤمنين, cure and rahmah, kindness, mercy for the believers. All of that are the applications of that zikr, are things that are coming from that zikr. If you look at it, irtiqa, you will find that the approach of the Quran in its text is the approach of zikr. And the tool that he's using is zikr, meaning the stories are repeated. Some verses are repeated. You read it and it talks about something, then it jumps to something else, then it comes back to this. It's as if there is an oration style. Oration style is very much appropriate for zikr, which is advice and reminder. The style of the Quran is not a textbook style. It's not a linear progression of the topic. It is like a circle. Says something to you, then says something to the Prophet. Then it is as if the God himself is talking. Then it is as if the Prophet is talking. Then it is as if people are talking. It is as if angels are talking. And of course it all comes from God, but it's just the scenario that is presented there for you. So my argument is that in answering to the question, what the Quran is, what is the Quran? I would say the Quran is a book that is about purification, spiritual purification. And in addressing that, the tool or approach that is being used is the approach and tool of advice and reminder, zikr. I stop here to see if you have any comments, and then I have a few more things to add to this.
Yeah, so two comments. In a hypothetical world or history, if, the Quran had not been compiled, because as we know, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not give that official order to compile it in a cohesive form that we have available today. Do you think, as Muslims, we would be lost today if we did not have a cohesive version of the Quran?
So are you asking me that, I want to make sure I understood what you said. Are you asking me that if the Quran that we had today was basically just a mixture of some authentic verses and some non-authentic ones, and we were not sure if it is what the Prophet had provided for us, then we would be lost? Is that what you're saying?
Because of the way that it was initially written down, what if we had mostly lost it and it wasn't just available to us in the kind of form that it is today?
Yeah.
What difference do you think it would have made on the Muslim community throughout
Okay.
the ages and
Okay.
today?
So let me try to answer your question in this way, and please let me know if you think that at the end I didn't address your question. It's interesting you raise that, because this is something that I was actually discussing with a friend a few days ago. So we Muslims, we say that the book of the Quran is protected, and it is the only holy book that is protected, and that the other books like Bible, Injil, and Torah, there have been changes to them. And interesting enough is that, well, Christians say the same thing about Bible, and Jews say the same thing about Torah. Obviously, everybody is defending their own holy book. Also, when you look at the Quran, I know that, of course, there are verses that are talking about يحرفون الكلمة عن مواضعه, and other expressions that perhaps suggest, and some people have interpreted these to mean that, so the Bible and Torah are totally changed. But again, there's another interpretation of those verses, and there are some great scholars who agree with that interpretation, that no, actually the verses do not mean that those books have changed. It simply means that they have been interpreted in a wrong way. So what I want to say is that if we think about it historically, in a way, we are all in the same club, because historically there have been criticisms, well, not criticisms, but there have been research that have questioned authenticity of all these books, including the Quran. And when I say authenticity, I mean whether it is 100% what was at the time of the Prophet. Okay, there are researches about this, about the Quran, that people argue, and there's a range. You know, they're in the extreme part of this spectrum. There are those who say, oh, most of it has been put together even after the time of the Prophet. But I think the ones that I agree with, not because I'm Muslim, but because I've read the research and I think it makes more sense, are those who say no, actually it's pretty much the same thing that was at the time of the Prophet, but we can never say that it is 100% the same. It could be verses that might have been repeated, but they were not intended to be repeated. There might be verses that have been put in different places, perhaps should have been in other places. Some words may have changed, and they say that some few verses may have been added to it even, yeah, and some of it might have been lost. But overall, yeah, it is reasonably the same book. I think historically, I mean, we can never prove that any of these books are 100% authentic. Again, purely on the basis of historical perspective, I think it makes sense to think that Quran would be significantly more reliable in terms of authenticity compared to Torah and Injil, simply because much longer time have been passed for those two, and we do know a little bit about the history of those two books. So that much we can say. However, the interesting thing, Irtila, goes back to what I thought would be what I think the Quran is. If we had thought that the Quran was a textbook, yeah, even if one page of that textbook was missing, it was a defective book. Because when you don't have that one page, you're missing something. A part of knowledge has not been delivered to you, is missed. So anything else that you read will be on the basis of very shaky understanding of what that book was trying to explain for you. If it was a legal book, and if we were thinking that, oh, maybe some of the verses are changed or anything, that would have been a disaster. Because again, how can you then rely on a book if you consider it to be a book of law, if you entertain even slight possibility that maybe something might be missing? But when the book is book of zikr, which is advice, yeah, then even if we think that, okay, maybe we cannot prove that this is 100% what was at the time of the Prophet, it will not reduce anything from the value of the book, because the nature of advice and zikr is this, that it is just repeating itself. It comes and talk about this topic, then comes back again. Just look at it. How many times the Quran talks about hereafter, about the story of Moses, story of Adam. It just comes again, instructions to the believers. This is the beauty of the style of zikr. That, let me, I mean, no comparison, of course, but let me put it in this way. If you record half an hour for me, yeah, and give me advice about, for instance, healthy food, right? Healthy food. If you do that in the form of a lecture, like a scientific lecture, then if that half an hour, if I miss 10 minutes of it, I'm missing something. But if your style is style of zikr advice. Repeatedly, Farhad, you need to make sure that you do not take too much sugar and things like that. You will repeat yourself. You are going through it again. Even if I miss 10 minutes of it, I still get the point there. Okay, so yes, I would say that because, more directly trying to answer your question, because the function is zikr, any book whose function is zikr, it 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 needs to go through significant forging and changes and missings and additions so that you can then say, oh, we really cannot rely on this anymore. I don't think, even according to most majority of the academic non-Muslim researchers, I don't think that was the case for the Quran.
Okay. Well, that's a fascinating way to frame it. And now for those who might have a general idea, often the Quran is simply depicted as, you said, the holy book of Islam. While true, it feels like that description barely scratches the surface. In your extensive studies, what are some of the deeper layers of understanding you've uncovered about what the Quran fundamentally is? Of course, there's zikr, but are there some other qualities that were discovered in your studies?
What you mean by qualities again?
Just the main characteristics of the Quran. Like zikr, you say is paramount, but is there anything else? Any other qualities that just came out at you?